a comenzar con las actividades del día de hoy. Antes que nada, les quiero dar la bienvenida en nombre del Centro de Estudios de la Comunicación, también del Centro de Estudios Teóricos y Multidisciplinarios en Ciencias Sociales. Cuando yo estudiaba aquí, se llamaba Centro de Estudios en Teoría Social. Me encantaba ese nombre. Ahora se hizo más espectacular el mismo. También quiero darte la bienvenida en nombre de ULEPIC, la Unión Latina de Estudios en Comunicación Política de la Información, la Comunicación y la Cultura, y también como un coorganizador está la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Campus o Unidad Coajimalpa. Gracias por estar aquí. Vamos a iniciar con nuestras actividades. En primer lugar, vamos a tener la conferencia del profesor Graham Murdock. Posteriormente, tendremos una videoconferencia de Bob McChesney de la Universidad de Illinois y después vendrá un panel que se llama Industrias Culturales Globales en la etapa digital. Sin más preámbulos, voy a presentar al profesor Murdock. Antes que nada, agradecerle. Thank you, Graham, to be here. Que esté con nosotros. Es uno de los principales exponentes de la economía política de la comunicación. Él viene trabajando consistentemente desde los años 70. De hecho, claramente ha sido un norte para nosotros en la metodología y las definiciones de estudios sobre la economía política. Siempre ha estado abierto a los llamados que se le hacen desde el sur global. Siempre nos ha, de alguna manera, extendido la mano para cualquier tipo de actividad que hemos realizado aquí en nuestro país y en toda América Latina. Además, en los últimos años, Graham Murdock ha estado trabajando muy de cerca con universidades chinas y coreanas, por lo tanto tiene un conocimiento global muy importante. El hablar sobre su bibliografía sería casi una conferencia en sí misma. Simplemente yo haría 3 apuntes de sus trabajos más representativos, desde mi perspectiva. Uno es justamente en donde él plasma, junto con Peter Golding, los carriles, por decirlo de alguna manera, de estudio de la economía política. Es un capítulo del libro que tiene más de 1000 citas para que se den una idea de lo que estamos hablando, que se llama Culture, Communication and Political Economy. Este es de 1991, pero tiene otros trabajos que habían ya desarrollado un poco qué es esto de la economía política y la comunicación. Me parece que ese es fundamental, que cualquier estudiante que se quiera acercar al estudio de la economía política lo debe de leer y trabajar, por lo menos en el seminario de economía política que yo daba aquí era una bibliografía obligada. Después yo también resaltaría otro artículo que fue sumamente interesante en los años 70, en donde entabló un debate con Dallas Smith, el cual se llama Blind Spots About Western Marxism, a Reply to Dallas Smith. Este artículo tiene la particularidad de discusión teórica metodológica entre dos exponentes de la economía política. Ahí es donde nosotros podemos ver cómo se dirimen argumentos teórico-conceptuales sobre una misma, llamémosle, tradición de estudio, el cual también nos ayuda a tratar de adentrarnos justamente a la economía política. Finalmente, ya simplemente para plantear la importancia del profesor Murdock en los estudios de comunicación, tiene un libro metodológico en el cual participan otros colegas suyos de la Universidad de Lower, que se llama Researching Communications. Y ahí, de una manera muy didáctica, Graham nos presenta justamente el oficio de investigar la comunicación, que me parece que también es un texto fundamental que tendríamos que tener como de nuestros libros de cabecera en materia de investigación en comunicación. El profesor Murdock actualmente está en la Universidad de Lower, anteriormente estuvo en la Universidad de Leicester, actualmente es vicepresidente de la EMCR, que es la International Association of Media Communication Research. En fin, yo lo considero un profesor de impacto global. Desgraciadamente hay muy poco de su trabajo traducido al español. Identifico en este momento un artículo que se publicó en la revista de Colima, de la Universidad de Colima, sobre el estudio de las culturas contemporáneas, en donde él hace una crítica muy bien planteada sobre la actividad de las audiencias desde la economía política. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? De que sí, las audiencias son activas, pero había que ponerles alfileres justamente a esa actividad de las audiencias en términos de no sobredimensionarlas. Esos son uno de los textos que está en español. También hay otro texto en español, ahora recuerdo, en la revista de Comunicación y Sociedad de la Universidad de Guadalajara, que es claramente un ejemplo claro de cómo se aplica la economía política en un problema concreto. El título en inglés, no me acuerdo ahorita el título en español, es Information Poverty and Political Inequality, Citizenship in the Age of Privatized Communications. Ese texto también es fundamental para entender el trabajo del profesor Murdock. El día de hoy nos hablará justamente de otro tema que ha estado trabajando en los últimos 5 años, que es las relaciones entre la comunicación digital y la catástrofe del cambio climático. Sin más preámbulos, le doy la palabra al profesor Murdock y le agradezco que esté esta mañana con nosotros para compartir sus ideas. Thank you, Graham. Do you have the floor?
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And as always, for me, it is a very great pleasure to come back to Mexico. I have not only old colleagues here, but actually old students. So it's always a great pleasure to see people again. As you can see in the title, I'm going to try and link two things together. First of all, the discussion about digital communication and the way it is being developed, and the now very clear catastrophe that faces us as a human race with the collapse of the climate. And I want to suggest why political economy needs to change to confront these issues. It's interesting that this year's Nobel Prize for Economics has been awarded to 2 economists. Both of them are relatively conventional economists, but they have been given the prize for linking together theories of economic growth and climate change, the first time that that has been acknowledged. When the 1848 revolutions in France collapsed and Louis Napoleon came to power, one of the first things he did was to suspend the Republic and to declare himself emperor. That had already happened once before with his uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had done the same thing. And it prompted Marx to coin one of his best-known phrases, that history repeats itself, once as tragedy, the second time as farce. Watching Donald Trump renege on the climate agreement in Paris, I think we can turn that upside down and say history does repeat itself, but the first time as farce and the second time as tragedy. Here is Trump railing against all of those countries which he sees to be treating the United States unfairly by demanding that they keep to the Paris Agreement, which was to try to keep temperatures down to 1.5 degrees above the level they were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We're already now 1% above. 1.5 is now acknowledged to be the limit. And you see he's holding a little sign there, Trump digs coal. A lot of the money behind the Trump campaign came from what we call the fossil fuel industries. These are industries which make their living excavating fossilized carbon, coal and oil. And a lot of Trump's backers were part of that industry. And so he's paying them back by this. But it's part of a huge new dismantling of all of the environmental protections in the United States. There's licensed new drilling in national parks. There's a suspension of all kinds of regulations. So Trump is really not taking climate change seriously. He's fundamentally famous for saying that he thought it was a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese, that there was no real solid scientific evidence. One tragedy came almost a month after Trump had risen to give his speech, when a huge part of the ice shelf in the Antarctic Ocean sheared off, floated away. There you see it. It's technically the Larsen ice shelf. It's the same size as Luxembourg in Europe. It's the same size as a small European state, a very large amount of ice. And it was one of the signals that something very profound was happening to the climate on a planetary basis. Another very well-known example is the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. You can see the reef is now in large parts completely white. Coral reefs are usually very vibrant, very colorful, but the coral in the Great Barrier is dying. And that is very much related to Australia's Trump-like position on coal. Here is a quotation from the former Prime Minister, but this position is held by the current Australian administration. I can think of nothing more damaging to our future than leaving coal in the ground. I can think of nothing more damaging to Australia's future than taking it out of the ground. But that's where we differ. Australia is the site of one of the great popular struggles of our time. The Australian government are proposing to build a gigantic complex of coal mines. Some of them would be deep shaft mines, some of them would be open cast. They're in the middle of Queensland in a place called Odani. And this is the biggest ratcheting up of coal mining ever seen. And it's on Aboriginal land. So a lot of the protests you see there, an Aboriginal elder, he's wearing a t-shirt, it's very interesting. He's wearing a t-shirt in solidarity with the Sioux Nation at Standing Rock. Again, another huge struggle over an oil pipeline that was going through ancestral lands. So everywhere you look, you see a ferment of activity around this issue to try to push back that big initiative to keep coal, keep oil burning. And now it's come home to everybody, because everywhere in the world, we've had the most unprecedented weather that anybody can remember and any record shows, including in Australia, which has a catastrophic drought, the worst drought in the history of Australia. So climate change is not something any longer that is happening in remote places. It's happening everywhere, and it's happening now, and it's going to get more intense. We ask ourselves, who's responsible for this? The answer is very obvious. There's some responsibility that lies with the communist countries that signed on for an industrialization policy that burnt dirty coal. Soviet Union and more lately China. But if you look at this chart, it shows the emissions of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the key greenhouse gas. This is the gas which is preventing the sun from being reflected back and is warming both the temperature and the sea temperature. You see, Australia has, these are the per capita CO2 emissions. Australia is way up there, followed by the United States, followed by Canada, followed by Russia. China and India are relatively low. And if we look at the historical chart, you can see very clearly that green part is the European imperial powers. The pink part is the United States. So you can see that historically, and remember, CO2 stays in the atmosphere for 100 years. So even if we stop it now, we still have to reckon with that historical legacy. So clearly the responsibility lies with those countries that industrialize first. There's absolutely no question about that. Now, how do we think about this? Well, one way to think about it, I think, is to borrow the title that I gave this talk, Minutes to Midnight. This is comes from a group of concerned nuclear scientists who began to calculate what the risk was to the world from nuclear power, but also nuclear weaponry and nuclear proliferation. And they expressed the risk in terms of a clock. The closer the clock moves to midnight, the higher the risk we have of extinction. A few years ago, they added global climate change to their calculations. So when they're talking about how far we've got before we all die, that's also part of their calculation. And that's why I've called the talk Minutes to Midnight, because I think we're very, very close now to the midnight hour. It's not just me who thinks that. Well-known old lefty radicals. Monday saw the publication of the latest installment of the publication of the International Climate Change Commission. They've been very modest. What this does is collect together the best of the world's scientists on this issue, and they try to figure out where we are in relationship to this issue. What they released on Monday was a warning of utter catastrophe. What they say is that we have 15 years left. Keep emissions down to a level that will keep temperatures at 1.5. If we go over that, we can't be sure of what the effects will be. So this is a warning from the world's best scientists. We need to take that very seriously. So how did we get ourselves in this catastrophic situation? How did we let it get to this point? Well, one of the most important graphs that's been published is this one. It's the result of studies by a group of scientists led by the American scientist Michael Mann. What they've done is to try to trace the surface temperature of the Earth over many, many thousands of years. And what they found, that blue line at the bottom, you see the temperature goes up and down. There are natural catastrophes like volcanic eruptions and so on. But it's relatively stable. The variations are within certain predictable limits. We now call that period the Holocene period, the period after the last great ice age. But what is important is if you look at the top, you see that red line. You see it shoots up almost vertically. And that happens in the middle of the 19th century. So clearly, there's a very strong relationship between industrialization and the warming of the planet. Now, a lot of people call this, a lot of scientists have decided to call this new period, the period where human intervention is the most immediate and powerful effect on the climate, the Anthropocene, meaning that it's humankind. I think it's much more appropriate to call it the capital OC. It's capitalism that has done this. It's involved a triple exploitation. It's very important to remember this, because if we don't, we misunderstand what's happening. First of all, and the most obvious exploitation, is the exploitation of labor in the major capitalist economies. And that, of course, was what Marx was concerned with when he was writing in the 19th century. But there's also the exploitation, and I don't have to tell you in Mexico about this, the exploitation of colonial territories and the dispossession of indigenous people. Capitalism was from the beginning a global system, and it was a global system of theft and pillage and murder. But it was also a system of the exploitation of natural resources, because there was an assumption that those resources were infinite, they were cost-free, they were a free gift from nature: coal, forests, water. And what happens in the middle of the 19th century is a fundamental change from using renewable energy, wind power, water power, to fossil fuels, coal and oil. And those energy sources are used to drive literally the great engines of growth. Initially the steam engine, then the internal combustion engine, and electric batteries. That was the basis of the civilization that we have built for ourselves. Marx, as a young man in the Communist Manifesto, he's sort of seduced by this. He's amazed by the scale and the pace of change. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, the clearing of whole continents. What earlier century had ever presented such productive forces? Now, what's interesting, you notice two of the things he mentions there are railways and the electric telegraph. We'll come back to why that's important in a minute. But 10 years after he wrote that, an obscure lawyer living in provincial France wrote a book that everybody forgot, but it's an amazing book because it predicts exactly what we're now facing. The man called Eugene Husserl, and the book's called The Tree of Science. This is what he says: in 100 or 200 years, crisscrossed by railways and steamships, covered with factories and workshops, the world would emit billions of cubic meters of carbonic acid and carbon oxide. And since forests will have been destroyed, these hundreds of billions of acid and oxide may indeed disturb the harmony of the world. Amazing perception. That is indeed what has happened. What I want to argue is that communication and transportation have been central to that system. Marx again understood that. He understood how communication was central to capitalism's endless cycle of accumulation. And in his lifetime, he himself benefited enormously, first of all, from the new railway system, and then from the electric telegraph. He was, for a decade, the European correspondent of the New York Tribune. And a lot of his dispatches rely on wire copy coming from the new agencies. And he was able to correspond with his long-term comrade and collaborator, Engels, who was living in Manchester, while Marx was living in London, because of the railway had speeded up the mail system. They were able to be almost on email. Every day they would correspond because the railway was fast enough to move between the two cities in half a day. So he knew about this. But we normally think of transportation as being very different from communication. We think of the telegraph as being, as it was, the first digital system. What happened when Samuel Morse invented his coding system of zeros and of dots and dashes, which is a digital system, on, off, yes, no. We sent messages down the telegraph, and while the message was traveling through the telegraph, it had no material form. It only existed as a series of pulses of electricity. So people had the idea it was very different from transport, because if you wanted to send a message in a material form, like a bunch of flowers, you had to transport it by road or rail or possibly even by ship. But the telegraph seemed to abolish that. It seemed to get around the problem of transportation. What that forgets, of course, and why we need to remember this now, is that that digital system relied on a whole infrastructure that was very material indeed. It was an infrastructure of wires, of installations, of devices and machines, so that although the telegraph itself was immaterial, the infrastructure that supported was anything but. And we'll come back to that because that's exactly why we need to understand how material this is. Marx was very keen on. He didn't invent the internet. This is a sort of a joke, but it's a quotation from Marx. Marx was again fascinated by the speed of communication, and he was particularly interested in the way that the telegraph allowed for new kinds of financial speculation, because people could get almost instant knowledge of the price of commodities, the price of everything, and they would make calculations. So it totally changed the financial system. It became a much more speculative, a much more insecure system then, and we all know where that's ended us up. But it was also, I don't have time to get into this, but it's also important to remember that all of this was part of an imperial system. It was intimately linked to an imperial system. And you may or may not have ever heard of something called gutta percha. Gutta percha is a rubber-like substance, and it was discovered that it was the best way to insulate cables, telegraph cables, when they were going under the ocean. It was very resistant to corrosion. But it's only found in a few places in Southeast Asia. And those societies were devastated by the pillage of this substance by the imperial powers. So there's always an imperial shadow behind the glossy brochure that you might see for different services. But I was going to skip over this very quickly, but the capitalism that emerged, another feature of it was that it was dependent on mass, continuous and escalating consumption. So that in the classical form, which we sometimes call Fordism, after Ford's conveyor belt that you see here in Dearborn, there's no point in having a massively productive system unless people will buy the things that are produced. Otherwise, you have crises of overproduction. There's just mountains of things piled up that nobody buys. So alongside the production system, you had to re-engineer the consumer system. You had to get people to want to have what was being produced. And advertising emerges as the device for manipulating desire. Here are two, these are both from the 1920s, and two very interesting, and they're just years apart. You see the first one appeals to people on the basis of price and performance. It says, if you buy that, you get a very good deal, and it will last a long time and not many things will go wrong with it. That's a kind of rational calculation. That's not what advertising does. On the other side, you see an advertisement for a car, not the same car, but very similar, which is all about lifestyle. What it says is, if you want to live like that, if you want to be inside that picture, you need to have one of these cars. So it's a much more psychological, it's about identity. And what happened as a result of that is it gave people an identity. It gave them the identity of consumer. It said, if you want to be the person you have always wanted to be, you can achieve that by possessing commodities and showing them to people, demonstrating what a tasteful person you are, demonstrating how much money you've got. This is the way that you can achieve your ambitions in life. Well, it wasn't the only way that people were thinking about that. There was also at the same time this counter-ideology of citizenship, which was arising with the mass democratic movements that said, you're a member of a social and a moral community. Yes, you have rights. You have rights for all kinds of personal possessions, but you also have responsibilities. You are responsible not only for your own welfare, but for the collective welfare of society. And you express that through paying taxes that will be spent on public goods, like public education, public libraries, public parks, which everybody can enjoy. And if you've been following my work recently, you'll see I think of this in terms of three moral economies. That capitalism has three moral economies. All economies are moral, by the way, in the sense that whenever you enter into any economic transaction, you're inside a system of relationships. All of those people who've made the thing for you, all of those people who look after you. So we have responsibilities. But there are three economies. There's an economy of commodities, which is the classic heartland of capitalism. There's the economy of public goods. But there's also a third economy, which is the economy of gifts. That is the economy of all those things we do together without asking for payment, simply to create shared resources that we can all enjoy. Important to remember that, because we'll come back to it. So, what happens is that system begins to crack up. You see a social settlement in the post-war period in the big Western capitalist countries, which we sometimes call welfare capitalism, where you have a regulated a system of capitalism. But you have rising consumption, but you also have a strong public presence. You have public ownership of key facilities like the telephone network, like the water system, and you have regulation of corporations. What happens in the late 70s is that capitalism confronts a structural crisis of enormous proportions. This is often forgotten. It nearly collapses. And in the blame game that ensues, how has this happened? Powerful voices say the reason this has happened is because we have too much regulation, we have too much state intervention. What we need to do is to free the system up for markets. We need to sell off all those public assets, let entrepreneurs use them, take away the regulations that discipline them, let them do what they want, because what they do will be for everyone's benefit. That's the language of neoliberalism. And have a look at this. You see these concentrations of CO2 suddenly go up massively after 1980. It's a sheer cliff, yeah? It's going up and up. I think there's an absolutely cast iron relationship between that and the restructuring of the economy under neoliberalism. Here's my chain of argument. And this is where digital devices come in, because digital devices enter at the moment that this fundamental economic transformation is taking place. So first of all, we see a proliferation of digital devices and their integration into every aspect of economic organization and daily life. We see the migration from huge, cumbersome computers to laptops to these, which everybody carries around. And these rapidly become all-purpose computers. They're not just telephones anymore. They're computers that allow you to do everything. And they become indispensable. People become paranoid if they lose them or they forget to bring them. I mean, I've seen people cry on the train because they've dropped it. It becomes almost an extension of your, you know, McLuhan had this phrase that media are an extension of yourself. Actually, I think this is. And I think, personally, I think it will not be long before we finish with it. This is very cumbersome. You have to carry this around. Wouldn't it be better if you just had a little chip here? You could talk to it. We'll be re-engineered so that we can communicate without actually having anything to worry about. So that massive and quick increase in digital devices, but it's taken place within this economic environment that's been fundamentally reshaped by neoliberal economics, which says the only way to organize social life is through markets and through the least possible regulation. And one of the key components of the crisis of the 1970s was a crisis of underconsumption. What had happened was that as real wages had risen in the post-war period, people have been finally able to acquire those big ticket items they've always wanted: refrigerator, television, maybe even an automobile. When they bought them, my family were classic. They expected them to last for a long time. We had a television for 25 years, and if it broke, if something went wrong with it, there was a little guy in the village who would repair it for you. You didn't buy a new television, you kept your old television because it was so expensive. Well, that was a disaster for capitalism because consumption was almost at a standstill. So they had to re-engineer consumption, and they had to re-engineer it to encourage you to integrate commodities much more intimately into your life. And that is indeed what has happened. And the digital platforms that have emerged, Google, Facebook particularly, have provided the ideal space in which that re-engineering took place because they're totally unregulated. I've been working a lot with children recently. There were huge struggles to regulate advertising on television for children. There are virtually no regulations on advertising for children on the internet. And the things that are there are not really advertisements in the classical sense. What's happened is the promotional pitch has been integrated into the cultural form. So advert games, which are very popular with children, where the game is itself is very interesting and very well designed, but it's littered with logos. It's littered with products that get the kid to recognize the product. So this is a whole new engineering exercise, an engineering of consumption. And so we come to a fundamental, I think, a fundamental cultural shift, which is the new possessive individualism. This for me is a very instructive chart. It really tells you everything you want to know. It's a chart based on a huge database of digitalized books in the English language, or digitalized texts. And it counts the frequency with which two words occur in these texts. The word give, which is about being generous to other people, being outward, and the word get, which is about having something for yourself. And you'll see what happens. See where the lines cross? The red line is getting, and the blue line is giving. And again, you see in the 1970s, the late 70s, getting shoots away. So we've created for ourselves, or the re-engineering of capitalism has destroyed or tried to marginalize those senses of solidarity, those senses of communality, the idea of public goods, the idea of community activity, and replace it with a consumer-saturated view of the self, which looks like this. This is not a joke. You can buy these toasters and you can program them to show your face in the morning. So you can wake up to congratulate yourself every morning. You can eat your face. This is the culture we now live in. We don't even think about it anymore. Just think about photography. You think, you did an inventory of photography. How many cameras will be pointing out into the world and how many of them will be pointing back here? I would say we've finished. The only reason we photograph a place is if we're inside it. We're not interested in the outside world. So, what about digital technology? Well, digital technologies are central to this for two very obvious reasons. Firstly, they're the prime driver of this new consumer system. They are the key to this. They're sucking away advertising revenues. They become the dominant platform for promotional activity. But there's something else. Those machines, you can understand that if you look at the interface of that. But we have to ask ourselves a different question about this, a second question. Like the telegraph, which appeared so immaterial and magical, this requires a massive infrastructure and an array of devices that consume scarce resources, they use energy, and they create waste. I'm just going to very briefly indicate for you some of the ways this happens. The ecological cost of a mobile phone. You can see it's more or less divided equally. The bottom half is the problems we create when we use it. The top half is everything that goes on before the phone ever gets to us. First of all, resources. These batteries and the inside of this phone depends on scarce resources. One of those resources is called coltan, and it's only found in a very few places on the Earth's surface, one of which is the Republic of Congo, which is still supporting child labor in the coltan mines. So there's a huge bloody chain behind this. We're complicit every time we use this with the most savage exploitation. And it happens again when this machine begins its journey. Here are two places, iconic places of this moment in time. One is a Foxconn factory in China, where they're assembling tablets and iPhones, and the other is an Amazon warehouse. They look very similar, don't they? They look like 19th century factories, which is what they resemble. And the levels of exploitation are levels that Marx would have recognized. One very famous example is the Foxconn suicides. Foxconn has put up nets around a number of its factories because people were so depressed and angst-ridden working there that they were throwing themselves off the roof and killing themselves. So they put nets up. But as Jack Chu has pointed out, where have you seen those nets before? You've seen them on the slave ships that were crossing the Atlantic, because that's exactly what happened on the slave ships. Because slaves were very valuable as commodities, to prevent themselves throwing themselves overboard, to avoid a life of slavery, all the slave ships had huge nets. And there you see somebody trapped. So again, you see this echo of empire. It's always there. It's never gone away. That's why we have to think of these as moral economies. We're involved, whether we know or not, in a chain of relationships every time we pick up one of these machines. Then what happens? They have to be transported. The mode of transportation is container ships. Container ships have massively increased bulk since their introduction in the 1950s. They cause enormous pollution in the oceans and also in the ports where they dock. Again, we never think about the container ship as being part of digital technology, but it is. It's a very important part. And then we get it in our hands and we use it almost all the time. Here are some recent statistics. We use it apparently for consulting the internet for 24 minutes, for social media 17 minutes, music 15 minutes, games 14 minutes, phone calls 12 minutes. You add all those up, that's a large chunk of your waking life you've spent intimately communicating with that screen. And where does the energy come from? Well, one of the dirty secrets is the idea of the cloud, which Vincent Moscow has written very eloquently about. It's a brilliant piece of promotional garbage, because we think of clouds as having no shape, being fluffy and almost immaterial. But the cloud is actually an enormous array of server farms, often in very remote places, that are consuming as much energy as some nation states. The more we rely on the cloud to store data, the worse it becomes. They're consuming energy, which is prodigious. They're also consuming vast amounts of water because they have to be cool. And then we come to the promotional pitch. In order for the consumer system to keep working, you have to throw things away. You can't be like my mother and keep the television for 25 years. You would be a very bad person. You'd be a civic disaster. So iPhone, look at this. I don't know, this is a very old iPhone because I refuse to replace it. You can see it's almost dead. But look at this advertisement. This is for the iPhone 6. We already have the iPhone 10 now, yes? Look at that slogan. This yet again changes everything. Again, again. Tuck it away. And where does it go? It goes, some of it goes, although the Chinese have now refused to accept it, it goes to massive, huge mountains. They're like the great pyramids of Egypt, except they're pyramids of old televisions, old computers, old circuit boards. And people are scavenging these for salvageable and saleable remnants. Many of those scavengers are children. But it's not just the hard stuff that this is made of. It's all the packaging. Pacific Garbage Patch is now bigger, and Joe will enjoy this, it's bigger than the state of Texas, which is big, everybody knows. Pacific is now an enormous refuse dump. But we never see it because we never have to go there. But it's part of the trail that this machine is leaving. So who's responsible? Well, very interesting. What we're seeing is a recomposition of capitalism in terms of the key nodes of power. Here's a very dramatic example of that. This shows you the biggest companies in the world, 2006 and 2016. 2006, they were what you'd expect. They were oil companies, General Electric, Gazprom, Exxon, and banks, Citigroup, Bank of America, and so on. The only digital company in that list was Microsoft. But by the time we get to 2016, the top 3 companies in the world are all digital. Apple, Alphabet, which is the holding company for Google, Microsoft. And also in the top 10, Amazon and Facebook. What that means is that the future determination of these technologies is in the hands of these companies, because we've withdrawn public investment, we've withdrawn public regulation, so they will decide what the technologies will be. And what is it they're building? This is the tip of the iceberg. So when we talk about digital technologies, we have to go way beyond that. And we have to get into the other areas. We have to get into the Internet of Things. There are already more machines talking to each other on the internet than there are people. We have to talk about things like smart advice, the little advisor that you have in your home. You ask it questions, it gives you advice. And we have to think about artificial intelligence. Google's DeepMind division is one of the leading forces in this. What's going to happen is that we're going to proliferate the number of machines and devices that are in circulation. First of all, because the mobile phone is rapidly penetrating low-income economies, like India, like China, like Sub-Saharan Africa. So there are more and more mobile phones in the world, and they're going to escalate. But there are more and more different kinds of machines, of all kinds, autonomous machines. But we have to ask ourselves, what's the environmental consequence of all? If we've got to the critical point we're at now, where the world scientists are saying we have 15 years to sort this out, can we really afford to let these companies pursue this policy of multiplying machines which are palpably environmentally destructive and are all linked to this new consumer circuit? Can we really afford to do that? That's, for us, I think, the really central question. And it's central because it brings into focus a different way of thinking. The entire system that we've built is based on a notion of growth. We have to keep growing. But there's a counter notion. And here's a quotation from Marx you probably may not have seen. It comes from volume 3. Even an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together, are not owners of the earth. They are simply its beneficiaries and have to bequeath it in an improved state to succeeding generations as good heads of household. Now, interestingly, that's the center of many native cosmologies. That's exactly what many native peoples believe. It's what the Maori of New Zealand believe, for example. And one great victory in New Zealand, you may not have heard of this, but one of the Maori tribes has been fighting for over 150 years to get the state to recognize their river as having the same rights as a human person in law. And the New Zealand government have now enshrined that in law. So the river has custodians. So it's no longer permissible to exploit that resource. This is part of a great historic struggle. It's a struggle against commercial enclosure of natural resources. Last month, there was a huge gathering in Germany where thousands gathered to celebrate a court decision that said that the coal company that wanted to expand into the historic Hombach forest could not do so. So the forest has been given a reprieve. Back to history repeats itself. As a very young journalist in Prussia, Marx filed a story for a paper called the Rheinische Zeitung. The paper's called The Theft of Wood. And what he's doing is tracing the decision in the provincial court, which cancelled the peasants' right to gather firewood and allowed the forest to be enclosed and commercialized and exploited by private companies. So this is a long struggle between two very different notions of how we organize an economy. And that's where we come back to this chart. Everything at the moment is on that far side. But if we have any chance at all of meeting the demands of the environmental crisis, we have to reenact and reinvent those other two columns. We have to think about public investment and public goods, but we also have to think about collective activity at a local level. Those are the only real alternatives. And if you want one book that I think is a very good attempt to think this through, is a book called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. She's a feminist economist. And she imagines the economy as a donut. That's this green circle. You know, a donut is this sort of tasty pastry with a hole in the middle. And she said we have two challenges. The inner ring, the inner dark ring, is what she calls social foundations. This has been the classical focus of political economy. How do you create a good society? How do you create a society that's socially just? How do you create a society of respect and tolerance? And everything we've done in political economy has been about trying to advance those aims. And how do we create a symbolic system, a communication system that advances those ideas? But we now have to add that outer circle, which she calls ecological ceilings. We have to be very sensitive to the way in which everything we do has an ecological consequence. And so we find ourselves in a paradox as critical communicators, because we've not really asked that question. We've been very interested in how to advance participation, how to advance social goals, and we've defended, for example, public communication systems, but we never asked ourselves what the ecological cost of those systems. And so actually, although we've won some great battles, we've also contributed to the problem that we face, because we never asked about the metals that they were made of. We never asked about where the energy came from. We never asked about who generated the electricity. So what I want to say is that for me now, political economy is indispensably not only about those traditional problems and they've not gone away. In fact, they've got worse. We've got the most unequal societies we've seen for 100 years. Levels of structural inequality are getting worse and worse. So we have those old battles left to fight. But in looking for solutions, we have to take account of that outer ring and ask, what kind of resources do these use? What kind of energy do they need? And what kind of waste will they generate? And how can we ensure that what our interventions are not environmentally destructive?
Thank you very much, Graham. It's very interesting, the issues that you point out. Me parece que nos pone claramente la conferencia magistral del profesor Murdock, un análisis histórico estructural de economía política que busca abarcar la totalidad social, además de explorar justamente la relación del cambio climático con el desarrollo de los distintos dispositivos y de las industrias tecnológicas, ¿no? Como se pueden dar cuenta, tiene un anclaje histórico fundamental. Esa es una de las características principales también de la economía política. Y me quedo con esto último también. Siempre la economía política tiene una filosofía moral en la cual busca la justicia social, busca tener mejores posibilidades de organización social y, por supuesto, ir limando las desigualdades en el planeta. Ese es a lo que aspira la economía política de la comunicación. Por lo tanto, me parece que esta conferencia magistral pone los puntos sobre las IES en donde tendríamos que nosotros también relacionar nuestra vida de consumo cotidiana con los grandes problemas del mundo. Abro ahora la ronda de preguntas y respuestas. Tenemos 20 minutos más o menos para estas. Como dicen en inglés, el piso es suyo.
Hola, profesor, soy estudiante de doctorado de Ciencias Sociales. Me impresionó mucho esta noticia que nos pone usted en su presentación.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Technology. No.
Me impresionó mucho esta noticia que nos pone usted en su presentación respecto a la decisión de Nueva Zelanda con esta historia del río. Yo veo a Europa muy concentrada en la cuestión de la privacidad en este momento con la tecnología. ¿Sabe usted si hay alguna otra corriente o intención de crear políticas similares a las que estamos viendo con esta noticia que nos da usted de Nueva Zelanda en Europa?
The New Zealand case is okay. The New Zealand case is very specific because it goes back to a colonial struggle, the Maori people against the British colonizers. And so it has a very specific history. But the principle, I think, is gaining ground now. That principle that the environment has rights. It's not just a legal issue; it's a philosophical issue. Do we have the right to chop down a forest, for example? There are practical arguments. For example, if you do that, you change the ecosystem and you set a chain reaction which we don't really understand very well. All the birds and insects go, and a whole series of things happen that are interrelated. And I think that's part of what's happening now. There's a series of new studies that have been coming out in the last 6 months that look at the interaction between different interventions, and they're interested in the sort of chain reaction in the environment, and how it affects all sorts of other processes. So I think there's an awareness that actually, not just to protect them, but maybe they deserve protection. And it's an extension of the very old idea of animal rights. For example, animals can't speak, but we've accorded animals rights. So the next stage is, well, okay, what about mountains? What about rivers? What about forests? And that doesn't, 10 years ago, that would have sounded crazy. You know, would have sounded like some old hippie, you know, tree hugging. But actually, it's probably the only way. Not chopping down any more trees and planting new ones, it's probably going to be a very fundamental part of the solution. So the question of how you justify that, and particularly in a situation where there's a huge pushback. I mean, the coal companies, the oil companies, they're not going to want you to do this. You know, so we're in a big struggle here, because there's a lot of money riding on this. Yes, so you have to have we have to devise a good philosophical justification, not just a practical argument, but to say this is something that is about our relationship with the natural world, that we have to rethink our relationship, not as exploiters, but as custodians. And that's part of this native philosophy. The Maori have no concept of property. You cannot own anything. You can only look after it. And I think that's actually a very important lesson for us to learn.
¿Puedo hablar en inglés? O sea, ¿se puede introducir al revés? ¿Sí? ¿Y se encuentra Florence aquí? No sé si... Sí, quería agradecerle a Florence. Creo que merece una ronda de aplausos para organizar este evento tremendo. La verdad... Es que la verdad creo que es muy importante que tiene lugar economía política aquí en la facultad, en la máxima casa de estudios, y pues quería agradecerle de entrada para llevar esa gente, invitar a esa gente tan reconocido globalmente. Bueno, para Graham, I can talk in English, right? Yeah, you don't have to use headphones for me, man. Yeah, I wanted to thank you for coming all the way here to Mexico City. I know a lot of people here appreciate your presence. And I wanted to ask you about, because I know that you've studied this too in your own work, about propaganda, because that's something really near and dear to me, especially when it comes to climate change. I mean, I know you mentioned something about the cell phones and how it's important, you know, we're using cell phones and there's workers being exploited, and there's, you know, CO2 emissions from them and stuff like that. But it reminded me of a really important, almost important achievement of propaganda in the public relations industry and in relation to climate change, which is grafting responsibility disproportionately onto individual consumers and individuals such as ourselves, almost making us feel guilty for being solely or disproportionately responsible for causing climate change, when in fact climate change is overwhelmingly caused by industries, by you know, fighter jet planes that are dropping bombs on Iraq and emitting way more emissions than even, you know, consumer jet airlines, or even just airline travel in general in comparison to car travel. You know, you'd almost think if you drive a car in Mexico City, you're ruining the world. And that this is kind of an achievement, I think, of global propaganda, and it distracts us from the, you know, true culpability of where you know, climate change really comes from. And for my own students in the college here, a lot of them are just becoming familiar with the public relations industry and how it's a billion-dollar industry and how powerful it really is. And it's almost kind of a new lesson for them sometimes. And I think here in Mexico in general, where the public relations industry is a little more nascent and it's a little bit newer and kind of growing and forming, and not quite as big as it is in our countries, in England and the US. So yeah, I guess I really wanted you to speak to those 2 points, because I know it's something of interest to you, and I think it would be something of significant benefit to the many great students here. They're really fantastic students, actually, that have come here to listen to you. And thanks again for coming.
Okay, well, you're of course right. I mean, this it is, in a way, this is a cheap trick, but you're right. The center of the emissions problem is with the organization of industry, but I still think that that relationship between the industrial structure and the consumer system is an important one to unpick. But a lot of people say, when I raise these questions, they say, "Oh, but it's so useful. I really, you could do all kinds of things." Well, that's true, but I think one of the things we need to think about is separating out the social value of these things. What do we get out of it in terms of, for example, communicating with people, and the way they're organized and controlled, but also the way they're made. So there's a lot of, I've been advocating a long time that as political economists, we need to talk to people we've never talked to before. People in materials science, people in energy. We need to have if we're going to have a reconstruction of capitalism, it has to be a comprehensive reconstruction, yes? And so what we advocate has to be sensitive to questions in energy policy, for example. And then we have to ask, okay, if we changed energy in that way, what would it mean for the kind of communications that we have? The same with materials. I mean, this is made from very kind of standard old materials, but there's a whole new science of materials coming up, which presents all sorts of new possibilities for making things which would be biodegradable. They would be very robust, but they would deliver the social value of the machine without the damage that the way that machine's constructed at the moment provides. And he died quite recently, but there was a very eccentric, he was a little bit eccentric, English inventor. Well, one of his great ideas was the clockwork radio. Yeah, he had a wind up. He said, "Well, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's impossible to imagine there being perfect electricity supply. So why don't we just forget about that and have a wind-up radio, cardboard wind-up radio? It works perfectly." Now, that's the kind of idea that we need to engage with. We don't need to be locked into the assumptions that are given to us. And we need to challenge those assumptions. And that means challenging those companies about the way that they behave, but also not just the digital companies, all the companies that they rely on, like the energy companies. So energy policy for me is a really crucial part of political economy.
Más preguntas. Sí sería bueno tener unas 3, 4 preguntas seguidas, pues para que conteste el profesor Murdock, y yo creo que con eso terminaríamos esta retroalimentación y empezaríamos con la videoconferencia de Bob, que está muy atento a lo que está sucediendo ahora.
Bueno, sí, soy César Rodríguez, profesor de la UAM Coajimalpa y también aquí de la facultad. Profesor, a mí me queda la duda sobre si hay una capacidad de respuesta del Estado, de las instituciones, del Estado-Nación, pero también de entidades como la Unión Europea, como naciones que pueden estar unidas por tratados comerciales. ¿Hay una capacidad de respuesta real en términos legislativos y regulatorios para luchar en contra de de este nuevo ecosistema de empresas digitales? Lo comento porque nosotros tenemos noticia regularmente de sanciones que hay en contra de Google por concentración o de Uber, etcétera, pero no sabemos hasta qué punto hay una lucha, efectivamente, una capacidad, así como se han renovado las industrias, en este caso en el terreno digital, si este Estado, nación o estas nuevas entidades comerciales están preparadas para este cambio tecnológico de grandes proporciones. Gracias.
First of all, thank you for the speech, thank you for the talk. I got a specific question. Beside this stuff of political matters and of political laws against all the industry, is there something about we as society, as persons, in an individual way, can do against all this selfie culture you're talking about? We can go back in a certain way to improve our usage of the stuff we already have? Or are we destined to just consume and consume forever and after?
Gracias. Doctor, yo tengo una duda, soy Sandra Vázquez. Tal parece que el sistema capitalismo, el capitalismo tiene mucha ansiedad de que cada una de las personas en todo el mundo se apropien de un celular, de una tableta, de esas tecnologías que usted nos ha mencionado, e impone el ritmo de la apropiación o del consumo. Y este ritmo no es el de algunas comunidades o poblaciones como las personas con discapacidad o las personas adultas mayores, que en contraste con este ritmo acelerado, pues van entrando en una estadística que va profundizando la brecha de desigualdad. Y van quedando fuera, ¿no?, de este acelerado ritmo. Entonces quisiera preguntarle al respecto, porque ese sería otro tema también, ¿no? Por un lado, la brecha de alfabetización digital que hay en contra de todo esto que también nos plantea y que le agradezco, que es alarmante y que nos pone alertas.
Well, thank you. They're all very good questions, and we will only be able to scratch the surface. First of all, regulation by itself will never be enough, even if it was effective, because it doesn't attack the operating principles of these companies. The really important thing is to destroy the business model of Facebook and Google, and that will mean taking back the data that they own. So the big struggle is one of the big struggles of the future is who will own what can be known about you. Should you own it? Should it be owned collectively? And that brings us back to a very old and central theme in political economy, which is about the notion of public goods. So let's take data. We've all given away so much of ourselves, and we don't even know how much of it there is out there, who's using it, what they're using it for. So we have to take it back. Well, one proposal is, well, we should all own our own data. There's a kind of market proposal, and if you want to sell it, that's fine. Well, I think a much more radical and interesting proposal is what's being called the data commons. That data is owned collectively and it's used for collective purposes. So, for example, to address your issue, there's a very interesting potential technology coming up, which is called augmented reality. What would happen is, with a cell phone, for example, you'd be walking down the street and you point it down the street, and it would tell you all kinds of information. Now, most of that would be consumer information. You know, there's a McDonald's at the corner, there's a special offer, blah, blah, blah. But imagine if we actually used that socially and said, there's an old lady who lives alone at number 39. She has real problems doing her shopping. Maybe it would be nice if you called on her. We could do all kinds of things with these technologies. It's not the technologies themselves which are the evil thing. It's the control of these technologies. We have to take back that control. And that's why I would want to put back this. Yeah, that one. For me, the real struggle is to understand how we could rethink these other two columns. The question of public goods and public investment. How can we make public provision that is openly available for everybody? But also how do we use the solidarities which are already there? All those people who went to the forest in Germany. If you think of at the meta level, you could be very depressed. But if you actually look at what's happening in a lot of localities, you see some very amazing things. People are coming together. So in Germany, for example, villages are generating their electricity from solar power, and they're making enough money collectively to sell it to the German grid, and that money goes back into a community fund for community activities. Now that's an interesting cycle. Yeah. So don't only look at what's happening at the European level or what's happening in the massive agencies. Look at what's happening every day where people are trying to change their lives by doing things together. And those are the people I call communards. They're people who are coming together to do something for themselves and for each other outside of the state and outside of the market. So I think there are beacons of hope, and we need to hold on to those. And we need to exchange the successes. We need to know more about the things that work.
Me parece que con eso cierra más que elocuentemente la presentación del doctor Murdock. Ahora vamos a seguir con la presentación de Bob, pero sí quisiera darle otro aplauso al profesor Murdock. Rápidamente voy a hacer una pequeña presentación de nuestro próximo conferencista. Robert McChesney es profesor de la Universidad de Illinois. Sí. Les damos 5 minutos, porque si no también nos vamos. Es que está impaciente Bob, pero sí les damos 5 minutos, 10 a lo mucho. Gracias.
Okay, I'll get out of your way. Was it okay?
Yes.
Bring under the fence in there.
Yeah, it's an obvious question. Of course. It's just that I always use the cell phone because it's something they could grip onto, right? You
Absolutely.
say, okay, look.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you talk more structurally, like you lose them. You say,
Sometimes but the cell phone is obviously you can't miss it as a topic.
No, it's
anything.
Well, they've all got one, so
So what's going on for lunch with you, man?
I'm not sure. I think there's some kind of. I don't know. We're in the.
I'll ask Florence.
Yeah, I'd love a coffee.
El profesor McChesney yo lo presentaría como uno de los principales exponentes de la economía política de los medios o de la comunicación en los Estados Unidos. También se caracteriza principalmente por su activismo político. Él, entre otros académicos e intelectuales, fundaron una asociación que se llama Free Press, que ha sido sumamente exitosa para presionar a la Federal Communication Commission, que es lo que sería el IFETEL de los Estados Unidos. Han conseguido en algunas ocasiones tirar algún tipo de concentración y regulaciones. Desgraciadamente no pudieron frenar la neutralidad de la red o quitar la neutralidad de la red, pero ese es uno de los grandes, llamémosle, trabajos que también hace Bob McChesney de la Universidad de Illinois. Yo también hablaría de dos libros recientes que son muy importantes. Uno de ellos es Digital Disconnect, que me parece que es muy importante para entender las contradicciones que tiene también el mundo digital, por llamarlo de alguna manera. Y otro que es muy elocuente en su título, que se llama Medios ricos, democracia pobre, ¿sí? Eso sería, desde mi perspectiva, dos de las grandes obras de Bob. También puedo decir que es uno de los académicos que vende más libros, ¿sí? Los tirajes de sus libros están más o menos entre los 5,000 y los 10,000. Para que tengan una idea, eso en el mundo académico es un bestseller. Yo creo que solo Castells en la actualidad, y el rey del bestseller en estudios de comunicación pues es Marshall McLuhan, creo que les suena. En fin, para ya no hacer esperar a Bob, que ha estado ahí muy paciente desde hace rato, le daremos la palabra y después intentaremos hacer conexión con él. Si no, inmediatamente después de su conferencia iniciaremos la siguiente mesa, que recordemos es Industrias Culturales en la etapa digital, la cual la va a coordinar Antonio Calderón. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you all very much for being here, for giving me the privilege to speak to you. And I want to thank Carlos and Rodrigo and all the people who organized the conference. It is an honor to be invited to be at this conference, and it's an honor to be on the same session with Graham Murdock, who's been someone who's been very central to my own intellectual development, going back to the early 1970s with some of his original essays, which remain seminal works for people who study the political economy of communication. I don't mean to date Graham because he was very young when those first works were written, which suggests what an extraordinary career he's had. And as I see the title of Graham Murdock's talk, I just wish I were there because I think it's cutting edge research, again, from Graham Murdock. And I'm sure you're all, if you haven't heard it yet, you've enjoyed it. If you're about to hear it, I'll try to keep this brief so you can get to the main event. I do regret not being there, and I realize that hearing a recorded talk like this is nowhere near as satisfactory as hearing someone live and in the flesh. So I'm going to probably make this a little bit shorter than I would have under other circumstances. The title of this talk is based on a book that I co-authored with John Nichols in 2016, People Get Ready, the Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy. And it's a long book. It has a lot of complex arguments and some less than complex arguments in it, dealing with the big issues of the digital revolution, artificial intelligence, the state of capitalism in the world today, and the state of democracy in the world today, how the three intersect, and going forward, what do we do? So it's a lot of big issues in there. And I can't talk about all of them here, but being a good academic, I'm going to do my best to at least touch each of them a little bit and sort of point the direction I see communication research needing to go to be relevant and constructive in the coming decade, generation, with the extraordinary issues that are before us. I would start basically with what might be called the one great overriding contradiction of capitalism. And on this particular point, Karl Marx really nailed it. He hit a home run. And that's simply this: capitalism inexorably generates an ever-widening gap between what it's capable of producing and what it actually does produce. And this gap exists because the production in the capitalist society is conducted by private interests for their own profit, and that determines whether the production takes place at all. And it's this widening gap, this widening chasm between the potential and what actually exists that leads to the immense social problems that eventually lead to a crisis of survival for the entire system of capitalism, or the type of capitalism a country experiences. Another way to put this, and probably the more Marxist way to put this, is that there's an ever-growing tension in the history of capitalism between the increasing integration and development of the global economy and society on one hand, and the fact that control over the wealth of the society, the wealth being generated by this society, it remains in the hands of a very small number of private individuals who control that wealth to suit their own self-interest, to seek profit. And that basic contradiction, that core tension, has never gone away, and it's only grown over time. And now we're very close to the breaking point on that core contradiction. As an example of how that plays out, in the United States, over the past 45 years, the output per worker has gone up quite a bit, dramatically, in fact. The average worker today produces something along the lines of 4 times what was being produced in an hour of labor than they did in 1973 or 1975. Yet if you look at the real wages, the inflation-adjusted wages for workers, they've not gone up hardly at all. Barely anything has happened. There's been a little bit, but not much. And as you go furthest down the pecking order, the economic pecking order, the increases get smaller and smaller to the point where they're non-existent. At the same time, as has been painfully documented, over the past 45 years or so, the wealth and income of the very richest Americans has increased exponentially. So almost all the growth in income over the last 45 years, and especially in the last 20 or 25 years, has gone to a very small fraction of the very wealthiest of Americans. John Kenneth Galbraith in the 1950s wrote a term he used to describe the United States capitalism then, probably at the peak of American capitalism. He said it's exemplified, I think it was Galbraith, exemplified by private wealth and public squalor. Private wealth and public squalor. And that's a good way to describe the United States and capitalist societies as a rule today. Now, there are exceptions. There are times politically when organized forces are able to make capitalism work in a much more humane manner. Northern Europe has given us examples. The United States has its own examples of things that capitalism would never countenance on its own, but the organized political forces have been able to demand out of the system. But this is bucking the trend, and Thomas Piketty's research from France that was published a few years ago, I think really laid that out clearly, that left to its own devices, capitalism inexorably leads to more inequality, greater poverty, and greater concentration of wealth. The only time that changes is when there's an extraordinary exogenous political intervention, and that sort of intervention happens rarely and is difficult to do. Now, this increased inequality we see in the US capitalism and really global capitalism tends to promote stagnation. It tends to promote rates of growth in the overall economy that are slower over time. And so it is the economy in general is a much more stagnant undertaking in this decade than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And this is really ominous for capitalism, a system that depends upon economic growth for its very survival. It puts tremendous downward pressure when you have stagnation on wages and working conditions for the mass of the population. And it also puts great pressure on the state to reduce or eliminate social programs that benefit the poor and the working class. So this is sort of the context that we're in today in the world, the broader context, the political economy, and the great contradiction we face. And people get ready, what John Nichols and I did is we talked about the rise of artificial intelligence and robotics at some detail, and how on its own, barring any sort of political intervention to change things, it will have the effect of eventually just shifting more of the power economically and politically to the owning class, to the owners, to business, to corporations, to capital, and making the ability of workers and the working class to organize on its behalf, or the poor in general, much less. That it will shift the power even more to those at the top and weaken those at the bottom. But we see evidence of this already all around us. With the rise of the bit economy, of piecemeal labor, of the precariat, something that anyone who has children or deals with young people, or anyone who is and has lived for a long period of time in the United States, sees a dramatic shift in the quality of life for a person in their 20s compared to what I entered 40 years ago when I was in my 20s, and the options I had in front of me. It's night and day. And this will only make that worse. And here is probably good to clarify this whole notion of automation, robotics, artificial intelligence. I think the argument that I'm making with John Nichols and on my own is not that it's going to come along and eliminate every job or most jobs in the next 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. No one can really predict this process very well and how it's going to take place. All we can do is sort of try to get an understanding of what the technology is we're talking about and how it might be deployed. And then after that, you know, it's hard to really guess exactly how it will play out. But this much we do know. The DARPA, which is the Defense Research Program of the United States military and the United States government, which coordinates high technology research, and is the organization out of the Pentagon that really bankrolled and led the lion's share of all the research that gave us the internet, and still exists today and is still doing advanced high technology research, coordinating it and bankrolling it. DARPA has had a program on robotics and artificial intelligence, specifically to work in that area now for well over a decade. And it's doing cutting edge work. And a couple of years ago, the person who ran the artificial intelligence robotics program at DARPA wrote an essay, and he started talking about what was on the horizon, what with the technology they're developing, with the computer power and the artificial intelligence. And what he said got my attention, and I think it should get yours. He said that the changes that are already imminent, that are coming, the advances they're making, are going to lead to a fundamental change in the nature of human life and life on Earth. The term he used to describe this, he said, we're going to have, in effect, another Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion, that was a term I had to look up, refers to the period roughly 540 million years ago, when in a relatively brief period of time, geologically speaking, 20, 30 million years, life on Earth, after 2 billion years of being single-cell organisms and very simple, exploded into extremely complex organisms, ultimately ending up in the dinosaurs not long thereafter. About creatures that could see, that were complex. In a really short period, it changed everything. And this is what the prognosis is for what artificial intelligence and robotics is going to do for humanity. It's going to really change everything in a way nothing else ever has before. Not the invention or creation of language, not the printing press, not the alphabet, not the internet. It's a whole different game. And it's going to have implications we should all be thinking about. Now, the head of DARPA, who wrote this essay, said the first place we're probably going to see it play out will be in the economy, because so many of these developments in artificial intelligence and robotics will be immediately transferable and usable and exploitable by business to have machines replace labor, computers replace human labor. So that was their analysis. At any rate, it's going to have the immediate effect of certainly undermining the power of labor in our economy. It's not going to assist the power of labor given the way our economy works. So that's another issue to factor into the world we are living in and are about to enter. And then, of course, there's the topic that I think Graham Murdock has alluded to or will allude to in his talk, which I think is on everyone's mind, which is the climate crisis. I suspect people at this conference realize that just a few days ago, the United Nations issued yet another report from its scientists chronicling the severe crisis we face unless there's immediate, sustained government action to address climate change. The consensus among our scientists has been pretty clear now for many years Our economy has to fundamentally change if humanity is going to survive in any way it would want to survive into the next century. The gravity of our times is crystal clear, although one would not know it to listen to a politician in Washington, D.C. So this is the world we live in today. It's a world that's failing in many respects. And we've seen the mainstream political parties in the United States, in Brazil, across the world, in Scandinavia, in Germany, all of them struggling. They're seen as ineffectual and incapable of addressing the great problems before us because they are part of the system that produces these problems. In almost all countries, we're seeing concerns about growing corruption along with ineffectuality by the political parties. They're struggling for survival, these political parties. That's the moment we're in. So to put it, all this introduction to what I'm talking about in simpler terms or direct terms, what we have today is very simply a contradiction between democracy and capitalism as we know it. We can have one or the other, but we cannot have both. Something has to give. It's the defining issue of our times. Because of this, we see the recent emergence of the two great political phenomena of our times: fascism, or right-wing populism, or neo-fascism, call it what you want, authoritarian capitalist politics on one hand, and democratic socialism. These are the two great, wildly growing and emerging phenomena as the center collapses, as the mainstream status quo collapses in most countries around the world today. You have it in Mexico with AMLO, of course, in his dramatic victory. The United States has seen the rise of democratic socialism in the form of Bernie Sanders and his extraordinary campaign in 2016, and the mushrooming, the absolute explosion of interest in democratic socialism among Americans, especially Americans under the age of 30. Jeremy Corbyn and Labour in Britain is another example of this as well. They all represent this growing phenomenon of democratic socialism, a phenomenon that in the United States, at least, no one was predicting this as just a few years ago. This has really struck, the mainstream still can't get their head around what's going on. They're the last ones to really get it. And it's extraordinarily heartening to see this take place, and it's long overdue. Likewise, though, on the other hand, it's quite necessary because on the other side of the coin, the right-wing populists, the fascists, are very much on the move. And this, too, is a very recent phenomenon. To give an example of how recent it is, when John Nichols and I sent the first draft of People Get Ready, of one of the early chapters in it to our editor in 2015, just 3 years ago, we said that the evidence points strongly that the direction we're going is there should be a resurgence of fascist politics in the United States and worldwide, given the political economy pressures that are taking place. And our editor, who's actually from Italy originally, she wrote to us, and you can't use the term fascism. People are going to think it's a pejorative term, that it really has no meaning, that you're just crazy. That term doesn't really apply to anything today. And that was just, less than 6 months before the Trump phenomenon, before the explosion of these populist parties across Central and all across Europe, for that matter. So it's been an explosion no one really anticipated, but it makes perfect sense if you think about it. The script, of course, of the fascists we're all dismally aware of, or right-wing populist movements. Their whole point is to undermine and eliminate democratic institutions, including a free press, to lean towards authoritarianism and crushing civil liberties, a love affair with militarism and secrecy, and they proudly lie and dismiss any criticism as fake news and propaganda unworthy of contemplation. Right-wing populists, fascists worldwide have their own preferences for demons depending on the country, but they tend to always fear and despise immigrants, ethnic minorities, people of color. The motto seems to be, if the rear end is above you, kiss it. If it's below you, kick it. There's a heavy dose of misogyny and racism and homophobia in right-wing movements and fascist movements. Ironically, these movements almost always tend to be anti-corruption. Trump certainly made a big deal out of that in his 2016 election. But once in power, they're invariably extraordinarily corrupt because they don't believe government, they don't believe in public service. So that opens the door to logically using the state to advance your own private corruption and self-interest. Right-wing populists and fascists claim to be concerned about advancing the position of the people vis-a-vis the super rich, but that's just rhetoric to get popular support. When in power, always, without exception, they serve the super rich, just all rhetoric notwithstanding. We see that with Trump. We see that with Bolsonaro in Brazil in the coming runoff election that will take place there. We see that in Hungary and Sweden and France. We see it everywhere, and it's frightening, and it's the battle we face. You know, we have a situation in the world today, going back to that original contradiction, in which during the course of this century, it will be possible to reduce the necessary labor sharply to provide a quality life for all human beings. It will be possible to address the climate crisis successfully, and it will be possible to effectively eliminate poverty, but it will be impossible to do so under capitalism. Under the current economic system, these technologies we have will not be forces of liberation. Rather, they'll be tools for corporations and ultimately repression. The lesson I've learned from history is that the only way we can advance is by having a democratic response to the crises before us and to strengthen democratic institutions. That's it. These are the institutions that give ordinary people effective political power and they're under sustained attack in the United States and worldwide. In fact, I'd say the United States right now is at the front of the pack in its attack on democratic institutions. Defending and radically expanding democratic institutions and practices, including in the economy, is the great and immediate struggle before us. In fact, extending democratic institutions and practices into the economy, I would say, is the crucial next step in the fight for democracy. We're finally at the point where democracy cannot just be on the sidelines. It's got to enter the actual control of the economy and actively participate. Have people actively participate in running the economy, not just as consumers and workers, but also as managers and citizens. Foremost of the institutions under attack by the right is journalism. It is despised and hated. Journalism, as we know it, is a democratic institution. Here, of course, we have a great problem. The commercial model of journalism, which is based on advertising, is collapsing. Advertising no longer needs to support journalism, so there's very little money for independent, private, for-profit news media. It's imperative now for democratic societies to find policies and subsidies that can create an independent, uncensored, nonprofit news media system where people can actually have quality information and produce it in an environment that stimulates political knowledge, awareness, and participation. I can't emphasize how important this issue is for communication scholars and activists together. It's an area I've worked on a great deal actively myself. I've been advising and working with people in the government in the United States, progressive forces who want to somehow resurrect some semblance of a high quality journalism. People in Canada too I've worked with, in the United Kingdom, with the Workers' Journalists Union there. And in several other countries. There's a lot of momentum here. There's a lot of action. People are well aware that the journalism system is collapsing virtually everywhere in the world. The commercial model is dead. And it's imperative we come up with something to replace it. It's pretty clear right now, just getting tweets and social media is no substitute for actually having human beings credibly cover stories in competition with others and drawing people into public life. I wish I could report that in the field of communication, the communication scholars are leading the way in helping us understand and navigate this new world of digital capitalism where democratic institutions are under assault. I wish I could report that. Regrettably, in the United States at least, I can say pretty safely that the field of communication is almost entirely worthless in this regard, as bankrupt as the social science. The preponderance of communication research being produced in the United States today is largely oblivious to the world we inhabit, the issues we've been talking about, or I've been talking about in this lecture, and largely disinterested in those issues. The focus and most of what passes for research in the field of communication is career advancing trivia, largely playing it safe, and content to remain on the margins of intellectual life as long as the paycheck can be cashed at the end of the month. It's pathetic and it's tragic. This should be the golden age for communication scholars. The great issues of our times concern the intersection of the communication revolution with the problems of capitalism and democracy. Communication scholars should be right in the middle of the most important research and debates going on in our societies, not just on the academy, but in the public. This is exactly what we should be doing. And it's someone like Graham Murdock is a perfect example of the research he's doing and what he's presenting at this conference. Of course, no one in Mexico or Latin America needs a lecture from an American on the need for relevant research. So I regard this talk as a strong vote of support, a vote of confidence for what you're actually doing. Please keep it up. And Godspeed, and thank you for the honor of your attention. I do not take this privilege to speak before you for granted. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you. All right.
Como se pueden dar cuenta, los puntos o los problemas que pone sobre la mesa es la contradicción entre la democracia y el sistema capitalista. Es uno de los problemas de investigación que ha estado trabajando durante los últimos 20 años Bob McChesney. Al mismo tiempo, es importante señalar que él es un activista. Esto lo lleva justamente hacia las organizaciones civiles. Les comentaba que Free Press ha sido un frente muy importante para intentar democratizar la comunicación en los Estados Unidos. Dejaría hasta ahí el comentario de su presentación. Ya, como les había dicho, hay dos libros muy importantes que nos pueden ayudar a seguir estas ideas, sobre todo sus fundamentos, que es Rich Media for Democracy y Digital Disconnect. Ahora vamos a dar paso a la siguiente mesa. Por favor, le pido a los expositores que se presenten aquí, que es Lorena Trevillo, Francisco Hernández Lomelí, Carlos García, Fernando Cruz y Antonio Calderón, que va a ser quien coordine la mesa.